Hello everyone, and welcome back. In this session, we're going to cover some of the key concepts talked about in chapter 13 of the text dealing with globalization. It's natural when we think of globalization to think of it in terms of the impact it's had on employment, and particularly with respect to the idea of outsourcing jobs from the U.S. to other countries. But I'd like to, for our purposes, to think about it in a much broader role, and we can see here that that role really is one of creating interdependencies, right? And so now we talk about selling overseas, and we talk about when we import or export product or goods or services, and we think of that again in terms of employment, and we think of it in terms of commerce. But I'd like to, again, think about it in ways that may not be quite so traditional so that we can see the impact it has on the global labor force. And that's really what we're concerned about in this class. So we think about globalization, the really pervasive integration of economies and societies around the world as a result of changes in communications, transportation, and computer technology. Obviously, it results in increased competition. However, that's not the only benefit of globalization. And so globalization also means many things to many different people. There are certain other concepts we want to talk about, such as foreign direct investments and multinational enterprises, and those are all influenced by this idea of globalization. And so foreign direct investment, or FDI, is really a category of international investments made by a direct investor, that is a resident entity in one country, in a direct investment enterprise, which would be an enterprise resident in another country, with the objective of establishing a lasting interest. And so think about this as an example would be an organization or a company in the United States that decided to create another company or an affiliated company or a wholly owned company in a foreign country. Well, that takes a lot of capital, it takes a lot of investment, it requires a keen understanding of the operating rules and regulations and an appreciation for all the cultural influences that starting a new company in another country has, or it can be associated with that. And so this idea of foreign direct investment, as a result of globalization, we see a dramatic increase in foreign direct investment, both overseas and in the U.S. Increasingly, companies are investing more and more in the United States. We see that in the case of China, and we see it in the case of India. A lot of that has to do with risk. Because of globalization, because we see these growing classes of wealthy people and increasingly highly capitalized companies in other countries, they now have capital that they're ready to invest. And so it's really begun to become a two-way street. U.S. investing in companies in foreign countries, as well as companies from foreign countries investing in United States. We often see it, like I say, associated with a wealthier class or more wealthy companies, really as a way of mitigating risk and getting some stability with respect to this newfound wealth. These investments then now have resulted in these multinational enterprises. And we really can't say that a company is multinational just because it sells its exports overseas. In order to be considered multinational, the company really has to have actually moved part of operations to another country by investing abroad. These lowering economic barriers between nations opens up enormous possibilities for multinational companies and the growing number of these national businesses connected to them. Parent firms and foreign affiliates of multinational enterprises, or MNEs, now account for 25% of global output. And while the main impact of employment is on national or local economies that are subcontractors or otherwise linked to MNEs, total direct employment of foreign employees has been increasing. And so another component of this global trend of globalization has been with respect to the financial markets. We know that after World War II, a money exchange rate system was put into place to provide a degree of international exchange rate stability. This resulted in the creation of the IMF, or International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. The Bretton Woods exchange rate system collapsed in the 1970s, and flexible exchange rates were introduced then. With many national controls on the movement of investment capital removed, followed by deregulation of the financial sector. The result of this has been that a significant movement of capital around the world has happened, with increased cross-border lending and development of new and restructured financial institutions. And so again, we see the impact that these interdependencies, and it makes sense when we think about going overseas to do business or having organizations come to the U.S. to do business. We tend to introduce new mechanisms for transacting, and these new mechanisms necessarily impact the financial markets. And the result of this, as we see here, has been the creation of the IMF and the World Bank, both of which are very thought of as or are world leaders in advising the business community and in assisting the business community so that commerce, worldwide commerce, is impaired and impacted as little as possible, and also concerned with bringing up the standard of living in these foreign countries, particularly the emerging foreign countries. And so, as we see here with respect to deregulation and liberalization, which are again components of this trend of globalization, that by deregulating and liberalizing trade quotas, tariffs, and other regulated components to globalization, such as national capital controls, on a worldwide basis, we see that many of the financial institutions that we just spoke of, like the IMF and the World Bank, are able to encourage and facilitate the introduction of free market economic policies in their programs. And so a broadening of the global market saw some developing countries, particularly in Asia, receive a great deal of investment and support for their exports. And with the collapse of the Soviet bloc, many Eastern European countries increased their participation in and exposure to the global market as well. Finally, these developing countries have also moved toward a market economy, many of them under the pressure of the structural adjustment programs of the IMF and World Bank. And so all of these components combined necessarily bring about changes to trade unions in the global economy. So the restructuring of production through new technology, the opening of financial and labor markets, and the deregulation and the liberalization of trade laws regarding trade have allowed organizations to concentrate on their core businesses and, as we know, outsource certain non-essential functions which were previously done in-house. Modifications in work organizations, spurred by search for more flexibility and responsive work methods, have resulted in more contract and part-time work. Also, the labor market's been troubled with the entry of China, India, and the former Soviet countries into the world economy. They're affecting traditional employment relations and the exercise of collective bargaining rights. And so, as we know then, globalization has presented significant challenges to workers and their trade unions. For instance, global deregulation has challenged national-centric systems whose national social and economic policies helped create a degree of social justice and economic equality. That has tended to come under the spotlight more because of all the components that we just talked about. International institutions may lack work in place that can deal effectively with issues of justice and equality. Further, capital is much more mobile than workers, so different forms of business organization and relationships have been created that shift employment and threaten collective bargaining relationships. And then just another example is that competitiveness and flexibility are still the main objectives for most enterprises in a global environment. These put workers into increasingly fierce competition for keeping their jobs, they exert pressure on social safety nets, and they tend to undermine workers' rights. And so the challenge facing trade unions in the era of globalization is to ensure that structural change and adaptation are achieved without compromising the goals of full employment and social justice. And so this was just a brief introduction to Chapter 13 and to get you thinking along the lines of really what is globalization, and maybe expanding your horizons possibly to think of it as more than just selling overseas or buying from overseas or outsourcing of jobs, but to think of it more in terms of interdependencies. And then to discuss some of those components of globalization that are really key to the concept, such as foreign direct investment, multinational enterprises, the financial markets, deregulation and liberalization of many of the trade and investment negotiations, and then trade unions. And so I encourage you to read the rest of the chapter. It also talks about the worldwide labor movements, and it talks about some of the factors that undermine or underpin these labor movements. It talks about the growth of trade unions. We talk about the International Labor Organization, which was essentially created as a parallel to the organization to the League of Nations, with the mission to keep the peace within societies threatened by class divisions because of capital and labor. And then we go into talking about, in the chapter, this idea about the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and Australia, and what their common heritages are, and how they compare the evolution of their labor markets to the evolution of the U.S. labor markets. And then we talk some about the European Union. And so these are all very interesting and important concepts to understand from a worldwide perspective on labor. So I encourage you to read the chapter and then continue on with the exercises and short quizzes on the chapter.